Leningrad, the city of Peter the Great, the cradle of the revolution, stood in the summer of 1941 as a monumental jewel of the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, the German Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, tearing across the Soviet border on a path of scorched earth and annihilation. Leningrad, alongside Moscow and Kyiv, was a primary objective, not merely for its strategic ports, industrial centers, and military facilities, but because of its deep symbolic significance as the ideological heart of Bolshevism, which Hitler vowed to erase from the face of the earth. The initial German advance of Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, was brutally fast. Soviet defenses, decimated by Stalin's purges and caught completely off guard, disintegrated rapidly. By August, the German forces were nearing the outskirts of the city, a distance of over 800 kilometers covered in just 2 months. Panic and a hurried, often disorganized mobilization gripped the city. One survivor recalled the initial shock. The war arrived with the speed of a lightning strike. One day we were living our normal lives, the next, the air raid sirens were screaming, and the reality of war was a physical presence, a looming shadow. The fate of the city was sealed on September 8, 1941. On that catastrophic day, the German forces captured Schlisselburg on the Neva River, effectively closing the ring of steel around the city. The last remaining land connection, the last railway, and the last road was severed. Leningrad, with a civilian population exceeding 2.5 million people, was completely isolated from the rest of the Soviet Union. The 872-day nightmare had begun. Hitler's strategy was simple, cold-blooded, and genocidal. A massive ground assault would be too costly and time-consuming. Instead, he decreed that the city should be starved into submission and reduced to ruins by relentless artillery fire and aerial bombardment. The problem of relocating and feeding the population cannot and should not be solved by us, the German High Command declared. The intent was not capture, but extermination. The very next day, a German airstrike scored a devastating, almost fatal blow. The target was the Badayev Warehouses, the city's largest remaining food storage facility. The ensuing conflagration destroyed tons of flour, sugar, and fat, a loss the city would never recover from. The disaster was so profound that even decades later, survivors spoke of the sickeningly sweet smell of burning sugar drifting across the city, a brutal reminder of the food that had been so senselessly lost. With all supply routes cut and reserves destroyed, the rationing system was immediately put under extreme pressure. On September 2nd, the daily ration for workers was 600 grams of bread. By October 1st, it was halved to 300 grams. For dependents, children, and non-working civilians, the ration was a mere 150 grams. Then came the most terrifying reduction. By November 20th, at the height of the crisis, the bread ration was lowered to the infamous 125 grams for dependents and 250 grams for workers. This was not a mistake. It was a deliberate policy of the Nazi leadership to starve an entire metropolis. The bread itself was a grim parody of sustenance. To make the rations last, it contained less than 50% actual flour, bulked out with cellulose, rye chaff, dust sweepings, and anything remotely edible. It was a dark, damp, clay-like substance that barely held its shape. People learned to hoard the smallest crumbs, to measure out their tiny daily portion, terrified of the gnawing hunger that was turning millions into walking skeletons. The arrival of the first winter, 1941 to 1942, turned the desperate struggle for survival into a scene from a medieval apocalypse.
Leningrad lies at the 60th parallel, the same latitude as Anchorage, Alaska. The temperatures plummeted to -30 and even -40 degrees Celsius. Fuel reserves, already low, were rapidly depleted. The electricity grid failed entirely. The central heating ceased to function. The grand city, built for imperial splendor, fell into a primitive darkness and cold. People resorted to burning everything they could find: furniture, books, even priceless archive documents and family heirlooms, using makeshift metal stoves called WWII that provided a brief, meager warmth before demanding more fuel. Water pipes froze solid. To get water, citizens had to walk to the frozen Neva River, chop a hole in the ice, and carry the heavy, freezing water back in pails, often collapsing from exhaustion on the way. Diaries from this period offer the most haunting testimony. The entries are obsessive, dominated by the single thought of food and calories. 13-year-old Tanya Savicheva's small notebook, which has become a symbol of the siege, recorded the relentless march of death in her family. Zhenya died on December 28th at 12 o'clock in the morning. Grandma died on January 25th at 3 o'clock. Leka died on March 17th at 5 o'clock in the morning. Uncle Vasya died on April 13th at 2 o'clock at night. Uncle Yosha on May 10th at 4 o'clock. Mother on May 13th at 7:30 in the morning. The Savichevs are dead. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left. The deaths from starvation and cold mounted with terrifying speed. In January and February 1942, an average of 4,000 to 5,000 people died every single day. The medical term was alimentary dystrophy, the wasting away of the body as it feeds upon its own muscles and tissues. The sight of the dying became normalized. People collapsed and froze in the streets. They were so emaciated, so reduced to skin and bone, that the elderly and children began to look physically alike. The living were too weak to bury the dead. Bodies were dragged on children's sleds to the cemeteries and piled up in great mounds, awaiting the thawing of the ground. Survivors speak of the terrifying silence of the city, broken only by the whine of German shells and the crunch of feet on the frozen snow. A Leningrader recalled, "We were not people anymore. We were skeletons covered in skin, moving slowly, conserving every single calorie. A journey of a few hundred meters to get a bucket of water felt like a march across continents." The extreme hunger led to the collapse of all normal societal structures. While many stories of profound self-sacrifice and sharing emerged, mothers starving themselves to feed their children, neighbors helping the weak, the darkness of human desperation also revealed itself. Ration cards became currency, then life itself, leading to murders for the sake of a single card. There were documented, if officially suppressed, cases of cannibalism. The sheer pressure of survival turned the city into a moral battlefield. Yet despite the unholy trinity of cold, hunger, and shellfire, the city did not surrender. This resilience was not simply a top-down mandate, it was a collective, determined defiance. Factories, particularly the Kirov tank plant, continued to function, often running on generator power and operated by skeletal workers, including women and children, who had taken the place of men who had gone to the front. They produced and repaired tanks, guns, and munitions, all under the constant threat of shelling. Culture, too, was a weapon of resistance. In the darkest depths of the winter, the famed composer Dmitri Shostakovich, himself an evacuee from the city, wrote his Seventh Symphony, Leningrad, a powerful testament to the city's unbroken spirit. On August 9, 1942, in the freezing, ruined city, a skeleton orchestra of musicians, some literally pulled from the front lines, performed the symphony. The concert was broadcast across loudspeakers throughout the city and even towards the German lines, a defiant sonic middle finger to the Wehrmacht. We are still here. We are still a city of culture. We are not beaten. The only thing keeping Leningrad from complete collapse was Lake Ladoga. the enormous body of water on the city's eastern flank, remained the single geographical vulnerability in the German encirclement. In the summer months of 1942, under the perpetual danger of German air and naval attacks, supply barges struggled across the lake, ferrying meager supplies and taking evacuees out. But it was in the winter that this route earned its legendary name, the Road of Life. When Lake Ladoga froze thick enough, an astonishing, desperate undertaking began. Truck convoys, often called lorries, began the perilous journey across the shifting, unstable ice. It was a race against time, weight, and fire. The route, about 30 kilometers long across the ice, was constantly shelled and bombed by the Germans. Many trucks broke through the ice, sinking immediately into the freezing depths. Drivers often drove with their cabin doors open, ready to leap out if the ice cracked. They drove day and night, ignoring the thin warnings, the constant tremors, and the fear of the dark water below, knowing that every single ton of flour, every drop of oil was a life-saving miracle on the starving millions on the other side. The Road of Life was not just a supply line, it was the psychological anchor that proved to the Leningraders that they had not been entirely abandoned. By the spring of 1942, as the ice road continued to operate and the Soviet Air Force fought desperately to defend it, the number of deaths began to decrease, and mass evacuations, though tragic and chaotic, allowed nearly 500,000 of the weakest, including children and the elderly, to be moved to the safety of the Soviet interior. This evacuation, combined with a slight increase in the bread ration, helped the remaining populace to survive the second, less deadly, but equally terrifying winter of 1942 to 1943. The soldiers of the Leningrad Front and the Baltic Fleet, meanwhile, fought desperately to hold the perimeter, aware that their families were trapped just miles behind the front line. Their resistance was fanatical, fueled by a mixture of Soviet patriotism, terror of Nazi capture, and the primal urge to protect their home. The Red Army launched numerous, costly, and often failed attempts to break the blockade. Finally, in January 1943, after over a year of failed attempts, the Red Army launched Operation Iskra, Spark. A coordinated assault by the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts managed to link up, piercing the German line and establishing a narrow land corridor just 10 to 12 kilometers wide along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. The breach was immediately secured, and in an astounding feat of Soviet engineering, a temporary railway line was constructed across the frozen swampland in just 17 days. It was a slender lifeline running under the constant danger of German shelling, but it allowed supplies to flow much more reliably than the ice road ever could. The worst of the siege was over, but the city remained under constant, murderous artillery fire for another full year. The final end came on January 27, 1944. As part of the massive Leningrad-Novgorod strategic offensive, the Red Army broke the German encirclement decisively and pushed the Wehrmacht back 60 to 100 kilometers from the city. After 872 days of starvation, cold, and terror, the blockade was finally irrevocably lifted. The city erupted in emotional, tearful celebration. Church bells rang for the first time in years, and a massive 24-gun salute marked the victory. The final cost remains a subject of painful historical debate. The minimum accepted civilian death toll from starvation and disease is over 640,000, though many historians place the number closer to 800,000 or even over 1 million. It is a catastrophe of a scale unmatched in modern history, a deliberate campaign of mass murder that stands as one of the greatest crimes of the Second World War. Leningrad's survival, however, became a cornerstone of the Soviet narrative of heroic resistance. For the survivors, the blokadnitsi, their experience defined their lives. They emerged from the siege forever marked by the hunger, the cold, and the knowledge of the human capacity for both cruelty and astonishing self-sacrifice. Their courage secured the city's place in history, a hero city that endured the unthinkable and, against all odds, refused to die.
The silence of the dead city during that first winter, 1941 to 1942, was more terrifying than the noise of the shells. It was the silence of exhaustion, of frozen hope, and of millions of people listening to the slow, agonizing shutdown of their own bodies. Every single movement demanded a monumental effort of will. To walk a kilometer to the bread kiosk, to descend the stairs, or simply to sit up in bed became feats of endurance only achievable by drawing on the body's final, dwindling reserves. This period, from November 1941 to March 1942, was the nadir of the siege, the Great Hunger. The daily ration of 125 grams of pseudo bread, barely more than 2 slices of a small loaf, was all that stood between a person and death. This minuscule allotment forced an internal moral and biological crisis upon every inhabitant. The body, deprived of carbohydrates and fat, began the terrifying process of self-consumption. First, the fat reserves vanished, then the muscle tissue. Finally, the vital organs began to deteriorate. Doctors watched helplessly as their patients wasted away, their medical knowledge impotent against the simple, brutal fact of total nutritional deprivation. The physical decay was accompanied by a terrifying psychological decline. The mind, starved of glucose, narrowed its focus until it had only one obsession: food. Everything else, art, love, ideology, even grief, became secondary. The famed poet and blockade survivor, Olga Bergholz, described this as a mental dystrophy, a state where complex human emotion withered away, leaving only the raw instinct for caloric survival. Diaries from this time are riddled with the obsessive cataloging of food dreams and the detailed, almost ritualistic consumption of the daily bread ration. Lyubov Chaporina wrote of the collective obsession, "We talk of nothing but food, food, food. People are no longer interested in the war, in politics, in their loved ones who are far away. Only food matters." The simple act of eating the bread became a performance. Some would cut it into 24 tiny squares, one for each hour of the day, to stretch the illusion of consumption. Others would dissolve it in hot water, transforming it into a thin gruel to give the stomach a sense of fullness. The desperation led to the utilization of every imaginable and unimaginable substitute for food. Wallpaper glue, derived from potato starch, was scraped off walls and boiled. Boiled leather straps and belts yielded a tiny, bitter protein. Botanical scientists in the Vavilov All-Union Institute of Plant Industry, a priceless collection of global seeds, worked under armed guard while starving. They preserved the collection, an act of intellectual heroism, choosing to die of starvation rather than consume the seeds that could one day feed the world. The city's utilities had entirely failed. The destruction of the sewage system meant that sanitation collapsed, leading to catastrophic outbreaks of dysentery and typhus. These diseases preyed mercilessly on the weakened population. Toilets were unusable. The waste froze and piled up in corridors and courtyards. The combination of filth, cold, and famine created a perfect killing environment, a relentless, non-discriminatory force of death that claimed the strong and the weak alike.
The collapse of the social contract was a terrifying side effect of the starvation. While the official Soviet narrative promoted collective heroism, the reality on the ground was a daily struggle against neighbors and acquaintances.
Ration cards were literally life. Their loss or theft meant a slow, agonizing death. Trust evaporated. Stories emerged of neighbors who, seeing a resident weaken, would wait for them to die to take their wood or steal their ration card. The extreme cases of cannibalism, though numerically small, fewer than 2,000 cases were officially recorded over the siege, were horrifying enough to become a whispered terror that haunted the citizens. The police created a special department, the Cannibal Hunters, but the very existence of the crime was a profound testament to the ultimate depths of human suffering and decivilization. Yet counterbalancing this despair was the miracle of the Road of Life, the greatest symbol of the city's tenacious will to survive. Lake Ladoga, the large freshwater lake, had always been the geographic vulnerability. Once frozen, the Soviet military engineers and logistical experts, facing overwhelming odds, conceived the impossible, a route across the ice. The first convoy of lorries, carrying 33 tons of food, crossed the ice on November 20th, 1941, the exact day the ration hit its lowest point. The operation was an act of constant, calculated risk. The ice was never truly safe. Trucks had to maintain a precise distance to avoid cracking the surface, a feat almost impossible in the constant darkness and amidst the smoke from German shelling. The trucks, painted white to blend with the snow, became prime targets for the German Luftwaffe, who called the route the Rat Line. Drivers braved minus 40 degrees Celsius temperatures, sometimes driving for 20 hours straight. Many lorries crashed through the thin, unpredictable ice, plummeting instantly into the abyss, leaving no trace but a black hole in the white expanse. Drivers developed a sixth sense for the ice. They listened to its singing, the cracking sound that warned of imminent collapse. They were instructed to drive at high speeds to avoid concentrating pressure on one spot, knowing that a moment of hesitation could mean a frozen grave. The poet Vera Inber, who survived the siege, wrote of the drivers, "They drive the road where death waits below, and death falls from above." Despite the massive losses, hundreds of trucks were swallowed by the lake. The Road of Life delivered the goods that kept the city from outright extinction. It brought in flour, cereals, and fuel, often only a few hundred tons a day, but critically, it also allowed for the mass evacuation of the weakest. Starting in late December 1941, the massive undertaking to evacuate children, the elderly, and the sick began over the ice. Thousands waited on the shore of Lake Ladoga for hours in sub-zero temperatures, often seeing their precious few belongings, which had been traded for food, stolen by opportunistic thieves. The journey was harrowing. Many evacuees died of cold and exhaustion in the open lorries. One survivor recalled her mother wrapping her in every piece of clothing they owned, saying, "You must survive. If I die, you must tell the world what happened here." Over the course of the first winter, approximately 550,000 civilians and 35,000 injured soldiers were successfully evacuated via the Road of Life. These evacuations were not organized retreats. They were desperate attempts to shed the population that the city could no longer feed, a brutal calculus of survival. Yet every person removed meant a fractional increase in the remaining ration for those who stayed to work and fight. When spring came in 1942, the situation transitioned from mass mortality to precarious stability. The ice melted, and the little Road of Life by barge resumed, still under German fire. Crucially, the city leadership launched a mass mobilization to utilize every available piece of ground for agriculture. Parks, squares, and boulevards, even the famed fields around the Winter Palace, were turned into makeshift vegetable gardens. Citizens barely able to stand were ordered to plant potatoes, carrots, and cabbage. These blockade vegetable plots became a vital, if small, source of fresh food in the second year of the siege, mitigating the worst effects of scurvy and vitamin deficiency. The second year of the siege, 1942 to 1943, was marginally less deadly than the first, but the suffering was more prolonged and insidious. The shelling continued, relentlessly targeting strategic sites and civilian areas. The people learned to live with the perpetual noise of artillery, developing a horrifying familiarity with the sounds of their own destruction. They recognized the whistle of the shells, learned the brief window of safety after a bombardment, and adapted to life underground. Inside the factories, the heroism continued. Workers maintained production lines for tanks and ammunition, sleeping on the cold factory floors, eating their meager rations, while keeping the city's military machine barely operational. This industrial resistance, fueled by sheer willpower, proved a massive frustration to Hitler's generals, who had been promised a swift collapse. The endurance of Leningrad was thus a combination of logistical miracle, military tenacity, and an almost superhuman capacity for suffering. But the people knew that Ladoga, the road of life, was not enough. They needed a physical break in the German ring. The continuous, agonizing attempts by the Red Army to break through the blockade would define the next stage of the struggle.
The second year of the siege saw Leningrad transform from a city dying of shock into a city surviving through hardened resolve. The starvation-level rations, while slightly improved, remained inadequate, but the mass deaths of the first winter had stopped. The remaining population, a fraction of the pre-war census, were the fittest and the most determined. Yet this relative stability masked a deep, collective exhaustion. The constant, nerve-shredding reality of German shelling was a daily reminder that the enemy was still there, waiting for the final collapse. For the soldiers of the Leningrad front and the Volkhov fronts, the siege was a grim test of attrition. The front line around the city remained static, a fortified belt of trenches, bunkers, and minefields that became the graveyard of countless Soviet soldiers. Stalin and the Stavka, Soviet High Command, understood that the city's survival was paramount, both militarily and symbolically. If Leningrad fell, the entire northern flank of the Soviet front would collapse, freeing up dozens of German divisions for the crucial battles around Moscow and Stalingrad. Throughout 1942, the Red Army launched several major offensive operations, Sinyavino, Lublin, all aimed at breaching the German lines. These operations were uniformly costly and often failed to gain any significant ground, leading to astronomical casualties. The terrain around Leningrad, a mixture of dense forests and unforgiving swamps, the Mala, was ideal for German defense, turning Soviet assaults into agonizing slogs. The failure to break the siege led to immense political pressure and the eventual execution of several high-ranking Soviet commanders, yet the strategic imperative remained. The breakthrough finally came in the deep winter of 1943. Following the decisive Soviet victory at Stalingrad, the initiative on the Eastern Front began to shift. The time had come for a concentrated, decisive blow to open a land corridor to Leningrad. On January 12, 1943, Operation Iskra, Operation Spark, was launched. The attack was executed by forces from the Leningrad front advancing eastward and the Volkhov front advancing westward, with the aim of linking up across a narrow German-held wedge of land south of Lake Ladoga. The assault was preceded by an intense, 2-hour artillery barrage, the largest the Leningrad front had ever mounted, intended to pulverize the German fortifications. The fighting was savage and close quarters. The German positions, particularly in the workers' settlements and the Sinyavino Heights, were heavily fortified, forcing the Soviet infantry to fight trench by trench, bunker by bunker. The struggle for the villages of Workers' Settlement Number 5 and Number 8 was particularly brutal, involving days of fierce street fighting. Finally, on January 18, 1943, the impossible happened. At 9:30 a.m., units of the 372nd Rifle Division of the Volkhov Front met with the 123rd Rifle Brigade of the Leningrad Front near Workers' Settlement Number 1. The iron ring had been pierced.
The gap was tiny, a perilous corridor only 10 to 12 kilometers wide, running precariously close to German artillery positions. However, it was a land link, a massive strategic and psychological victory. The response from the Stavka was immediate and unprecedented. The Soviet leadership ordered the construction of a railway line, running entirely within the narrow contested corridor, to begin immediately. The engineering feat that followed was astonishing. In the dead of winter, through swamps and over frozen ground, under constant German fire, engineers and workers raced against time. They laid 33 kilometers of track, built bridges, and installed anti-aircraft batteries in just 17 days. The line, crudely but effectively named the Road of Victory, was operational by February 7, 1943.
The arrival of the first train into Leningrad carrying full supplies, rather than just the few tons that the ice road could manage, was met with an outpouring of emotion that dwarfed all previous expressions of resilience. It was a visible, tangible symbol that the city was no longer alone, no longer dependent on the whim of the ice or the daring of the lorry drivers. Though the city remained under constant shelling from the German long-range guns, the immediate threat of total starvation was lifted. Rations were increased significantly, moving out of the zone of guaranteed mortality. The final phase of the siege, from January 1943 to January 1944, was a year of grim, enduring punishment. The Germans continued their policy of destruction, subjecting the city to continuous artillery fire. They knew they could no longer starve the population, so they attempted to bombard it into submission. Long-range German artillery, positioned far enough away to be out of reach of most Soviet counter-battery fire, rained shells indiscriminately on civilian areas, hospitals, and cultural landmarks. Leningraders coined the term the Second Siege for this final year. They built intricate bomb shelters, learned to distinguish the whistle of incoming shells from the sound of outgoing Soviet fire, and continued their daily routines under the shadow of sudden death. Teachers conducted lessons in freezing schools, separated from their students by a curtain so that they could not see the children's wasting bodies. The workers continued to operate their machines, often wearing helmets and huddled near sandbags. The final complete relief of the city began in mid-January 1944. As part of the Red Army's broader strategic push in the north, the Soviet forces launched the massive Leningrad-Novgorod strategic offensive. This time, the assault was designed to decisively crush the German Army Group North and push them out of artillery range permanently. The offensive was a colossal success. Soviet forces managed to outflank and shatter the German defenses, forcing a rapid, chaotic retreat. Within 2 weeks, the German lines were pushed back 60 to 100 kilometers. The enemy guns that had tormented the city for 872 days finally fell silent. On the night of January 27, 1944, the entire city erupted. The order was given for a massive artillery salute, a full 24-gun salute, the only such salute authorized by Stalin not to take place in Moscow, a testament to the city's unique and brutal sacrifice. The emotional impact of that night was profound. People flooded the streets, weeping, cheering, and embracing strangers. The air raid sirens that had symbolized terror for nearly 3 years were silent. The long, terrifying ordeal was finally over. One survivor wrote of the moment, "We were crying and laughing at the same time. The sound of the salute was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of life, of victory, of an end to the frozen hell." The legacy of the Siege of Leningrad is a heavy and complex one. Militarily, it tied down crucial German divisions and prevented a catastrophe on the Soviet Northern Front, a sacrifice that arguably contributed directly to the ultimate Soviet victory. Demographically, it was one of the greatest civilian catastrophes in the history of warfare. The official Soviet death toll of 641,803 civilians, over 90% of whom died from starvation and cold, is considered a conservative minimum. Historians widely accept that the true number likely exceeded 800,000 civilian dead, with some estimates reaching over 1 million civilian dead. The human cost in collective trauma, lost generations, and the psychological scars left on the Blokadnitsy, the survivors, is incalculable. After the war, Leningrad was deservedly named a hero city, the highest honor bestowed for the courage of its people. Yet for decades under Stalin, the true horror of the siege, the starvation, the cannibalism, the massive civilian mortality, was often suppressed or minimized in favor of a simpler narrative of heroic military and party leadership. Today, the Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery stands as the somber heart of the city's memory, the resting place of 500,000 victims in mass graves. The monument there features the words of Olga Berkolts, etched into the granite: "No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten." The Siege of Leningrad remains an eternal testament to human endurance against a foe bent on absolute annihilation, and a stark, indelible reminder of the true, appalling cost of total war.